eloquent speech and oratory rule supreme over the people of that age. Accordingly, he brought for them on God's behalf a book of admonishment and wisdom by which he refuted their allegations and sealed his case against them. Right? So we've heard these stories about how eloquent the Arabs were. Right? They could extemporaneously say beautiful poetry. They could memorize things. Hearing it one time, they could memorize a whole sermon. Right? Amazing things like that. Their linguistic skills were excellent. So in a time when linguistic skills were at a peak, Allah sends a miracle which is going to challenge that and topple the linguistic excellence that they had at that time. Ibn Sakit says, by God, he replies to Imam Hadi, by God, I have never seen the likes of you. He's just awed by Imam Hadi. I've never seen the likes of you. Then he says, he kind of understands that these miracles were appropriate for the time. Then he says, then what seals God's case against his creatures today? And today, we're in the age of the imamate. He's talking about Imam Hadi, the 10th imam. That's right, the 10th imam. And he says, like, what's the miracle today? There are people who doubt whether you are the imam or not. Right? Has God sent an appropriate miracle for you to establish your imamate? The same way He sent appropriate miracles for all the prophets to establish their prophethood? The Imam Hadi replies, the intellect. The intellect that God's planted within us, that's sufficient. Through it, one knows who speaks truthfully about God, affirming Him accordingly, and who speaks lies about God, repudiating Him accordingly. The meaning of the Imam's answer is this. He says that in all cases, even when you see a miracle, and the miracle kind of makes you believe in the person, it's really your intellect that's at work. There's a logical argument going on in your mind. And our intellect knows that certain feats are not possible, not humanly possible. Parting the Red Sea, turning a piece of wood into a snake and so forth. These are not humanly possible. You can't raise the dead humanly. Right, so our mind knows that nobody can do this if they're only human. It's a godly act. So anyone who can do this, anyone who can do a godly act, must either be God Himself or have power from God, directly from God. And now when the prophet, the person who's doing the miracle is not claiming he's God, and he's saying, I'm not doing it on my own accord, I'm doing it because of God, he's inviting people to God, then logically it establishes that yes, this person is telling the truth, he's not calling us towards himself, rather he's making a claim for God, the one who has the power to do this miracle. Right, so that's the logical process that we go through when we see a miracle. So that gets us to the point where we're certain, intellectually certain that yes, this person is telling the truth. Then he says, in our current age, we don't need this anymore. Now, the intellect itself is sufficient. We have the miracle of the Quran to establish the prophethood of our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so it establishes the credibility of the Quran and the Prophet. Then the Quran itself, which is already, we established the credibility of the Quran itself says that it's not going to be corrupted. It's going to be protected. God's guarantee is going to be protected. Right, so now we have a constant, like a living Quran that's going to continually stay exactly the same. We have a sunnah of the Prophet. That's all we need. That's the standard by which we're going to judge anything and anyone who claims to be an imam. So now anyone who comes along and says, I am your imam, I am your leader, we have a standard, and we compare this person's actions, his teachings, right? Everything that he does, we compare it with the Quran and with the Sunnah of the Prophet, and we see, does he match up or not? Our intellect is sufficient to make this judgment and say, this person is exactly like the Prophet, or no, this person looks nothing like the Prophet. Right? And we see that. You can use that standard very, very easily. You look at Abu Bakr and the Prophet, look at Umar and the Prophet, and compare them, Uthman and the Prophet, and see, is there any similarity between the two? Yeah, they're both human beings, they're both Homo sapien, but other than that, there's not much other similarity. Right? And so you make that comparison, and you say, no, these guys are lying, they're not truly the imam, and because they don't fit the standard. Ali alayhi salam he's a walking prophet. He has the knowledge of the Prophet, he speaks like the Prophet, talks like the Prophet, fights like the Prophet, makes peace like the Prophet. Everything he does is just like the Prophet. He lives the sunnah. Right? In the same way for every imam after him, right, we have all sorts of fake imams coming up, claiming to be imams, and all you have to do is compare them to the Quran and the Sunnah, and the intellect says that no, they're lying. They're making false claims because they don't match the standard. And so when he says this, then Ibn Sikhi finally says, that's the answer. He says, that's the answer I was looking for. He's totally content. He's really happy with the Imam. He goes off and he preaches this hadith. So it's just something that's curious and interesting because we're talking about miracles of Isa alayhi salam. Sallu ala nabi wa ali. Just two major lessons that I want to get out of this section. One is to reaffirm our faith in miracles. The miracles are real. There's a tendency sometimes with our kind of hyper-scientific mind in society to always want to explain everything in scientific terms and say, oh, well, it's actually like quantum physics can explain, how this actually works. And miracles they're not explicable. They're not reproducible by any human being at any time. Human faculties can never reproduce the miracles. If it can, then the miracles are useless, and we shouldn't believe in them in the first place. Because all it would mean then is that this person was ahead of his time. It wouldn't mean that he's divinely inspired and he's tapping into divine power. All it would mean was that this person is a little ahead of his time. Two millennia earlier, he was able to part the sea. Right? It just took the rest of us 2,000 years to catch up to him. Right? That's all that it would mean. So miracles are real, and the Quran is full of miracles. Right? So there's no room for a skeptic. If you're going to accept the Quran as the truth, then there's no room for skeptics about miracles. Now that doesn't mean that we should believe every miracle that we hear. Right? It's one thing to believe that miracles are possible, miracles are real, and they have happened like crazy in the past. All these prophets are constantly bringing these miracles. That's one thing to believe. It's another thing to then confirm a particular miracle that you hear outside of the Quran. Right? We have no obligation to do that. We shouldn't deny it if it's possible. Right? We know miracles are possible, so we don't necessarily have to deny and say, no, it's not even possible. This miracle that I'm hearing about in Pakistan, or this miracle that I'm hearing about from such and such place. Or sometimes we hear the stories of the Imams where there are miraculous things happening. Right? We don't necessarily have to confirm it and say, yes, it must have happened because there's one hadith about it. We don't necessarily have to say that, but we shouldn't deny it and say, no, it's impossible. It doesn't make any logical sense, so I'm not going to accept that the Imam could have done this miracle. Right? Why deny? There's nothing illogical about a miracle. If there is, then the whole Quran is illogical. There are so many miracles in the Quran. Right? Miracles are not illogical. They're simply things that are not humanly possible, physically possible. Okay? So miracles are real. The second one is this message that I wanted to extract from yesterday's lesson. That we need to establish our credibility with people as Muslims. Just as the prophets had to establish their credibility as prophets by bringing these miracles. Right? So make this a focus of your own life and your own personal relationships with people. Establish your credibility as an outstanding human being, an outstanding Muslim. And once you do that, then the da'wah will kind of flow easily from there. Calling people, attracting people to Islam will very easily come. There's one hadith from the Imams, they say, كُونُوا دُعَاةً بِغَيْرِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ كُونُوا دُعَاةً لَنَا بِغَيْرِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ Invite people to us without your tongues. Invite people to us without your tongues, or with other than your tongues. Now they don't mean, like a lot of times Shias will say, oh, we don't have any sort of, we shouldn't teach anyone about the religion with our tongue. We shouldn't preach anything about the truth of the religion with our tongue.